When we talk about obesity, we have all gone through many articles related to it, and the question arises as to who is the one responsible for this. Nowadays, children and teenagers love spending hours in front of their screens, whether it be the television screen, or the iPhones, or the computer screen. And I wonder, why has it become so difficult for the parents to take control over all of it? The reasons could be thousands, and all of them true, of course. Well, the truth is that too much screen time and less of physical activity can lead to childhood obesity. But a lot of that also depends upon the parents or the guardians too. They are the ones responsible for providing and conditioning an environment that helps a child maintain a lifestyle that is beneficial to their health. On that note, let me introduce to you about a chapter, A Triumph of Surgery. A Triumph of Surgery is the story of a woman who loved her pet dog so much that she nearly killed it by overfeeding it. A doctor who knew where the problem lay takes the nearly dead dog to his clinic for a surgery, and the dog recovers amazingly after the surgery. What surgery did the doctor do? Did he really do any surgery at all? James Alfred White, known by the pen name James Harriet, was a British veterinary surgeon and writer. Born in Sunderland, England, White lived in Glasgow during his childhood and teenage years. After graduating from Glasgow Veterinary College in 1939, White moved back to England and was a veterinarian in the Yorkshire Dales for almost 50 years. He is best known for writing a series of 8 books set in the 1930s to 1950s Yorkshire Dales about animals and their owners, which began with If Only They Could Talk, first published in 1970. It was the first of the famous series based on his life working as a vet and his training in the Royal Air Force during the Second World War. There have been multiple television and film adaptations of White's books, including the 1975 film All Creatures, Great and Small, and the BBC television series of the same name. Animals certainly play a significant role in most of the stories, but he was just as interested in their owners as he were in his patients. Harriet presents the Yorkshire animals as an element of pain and drama. He presents the owners to feel and express joy, sadness, and sometimes triumph. Dr. James Harriet, a veterinarian doctor, narrates the story of Tricky the dog and how he gets better. He saw Tricky one day with his owner, Mrs. Pumphrey. James was shocked to see Tricky's appearance. He was seriously overweight and had bloodshot eyes. Mrs. Pumphrey quickly explained that she thought Tricky was suffering from malnutrition, so she fed him some malt, cod liver oil, and a bowl of Horlicks. She also confessed that she fed him some cream cakes and chocolate. Dr. Harriet realized the situation was bad. He knew Tricky could never say no to food, so he gave the lady some stern advice. However, as he watched Mrs. Pumphrey walk away with Tricky, he thought it wouldn't be long before he heard from her. Sure enough, Mrs. Pumphrey called a few days later. It seemed Tricky was refusing food and was suffering from bouts of vomiting. Dr. Harriet had already made a plan by then. He knew that the only way to cure Tricky was to get him away from the house and into his clinic. So, he came to Mrs. Pumphrey's house and suggested Tricky be removed to his clinic for 2 weeks. Mrs. Pumphrey almost fainted at the suggestion, but the narrator was firm. Grabbing hold of Tricky, Dr. Harriet carried him down to his car. The whole household was in an uproar. The staff rushed about getting blankets, bowls, clothes, and toys for Tricky. The narrator, realizing the items would not fit in his car, quickly drove away. From his rear view mirror, he saw the entire household standing on the road in tears. At his clinic, his dogs came rushing to him. Tricky, in contrast, just stared at them with dull eyes. For the next 2 days, Tricky was given only water and no food. At the end of the day, Tricky started showing some interest in his surroundings. On the 3rd day, the narrator led Tricky to the dogs playing in the yard. Tricky slowly followed the dogs around as they played. Later, after the dogs were fed, Tricky sniffed their bowls, licking them casually. The next day, when a bowl was set from him, Tricky joined the other dogs for his meal. That was a turning point for Tricky. From then on, he made rapid progress. He ran around with the dogs, fighting them for food and hunting rats at night. On hearing that, Mrs. Pumphrey started bringing around baskets of eggs. Then she started sending wine. Lunch became a fun affair with glasses of wine before and during the meal. Finally, she sent a bottle of brandy. Dr. Harriet and his partner reverently enjoyed this drink at dinner. Dr. Harriet was tempted to keep Tricky permanently, if only for the fine spirits and the eggs. But he knew that Mrs. Pumphrey was suffering. So he called her and gave her the good news. Within minutes, Mrs. Pumphrey arrived at the clinic. There was a marked change in Tricky now. No longer was he a fat, bloated animal. Now he was agile and well-muscled and kept up well with the other dogs. Dr. Harriet carried Tricky back to Mrs. Pumphrey's car. The minute Tricky saw his owner, he jumped out the narrator's arms and rushed at Mrs. Pumphrey. She tried to defend herself as Tricky barked and licked her face. Mrs. Pumphrey, with tearful eyes, thanked the narrator. She believed it was a triumph of surgery. Dr. Harriet was a duty-bound veterinary doctor. He used to visit Mrs. Pumphrey's house for the regular checkups for her dog, Tricky. Dr. Harriet was quite worried about the dog's health, as he knew that the dog was overfed by his owner. He advised Mrs. Pumphrey to keep him off the rich diet and give him a lot of exercise, but she didn't bother. Hence, in order to improve Tricky's health, he decided to take him away from Mrs. Pumphrey. He told her that the dog needed a surgery. He made Tricky cut down his diet and made him do certain exercises which improved his health. Although he knew Mrs. Pumphrey was very rich and very attached to the dog, he did not take any advantage of it. He just performed his duties and eventually returned the dog to its rightful owner. Mrs. Pumphrey was a rich lady who had a small dog named Tricky as a pet. Though she loved her pet dearly, she was being foolishly indulgent. She would pamper the dog by giving him chocolates, cakes, juice, eggs, and wine. But little did she know that the dog needed exercise too. And obviously, when Tricky fell sick due to all the overeating and lack of exercise, she became anxious and sad. Though Mrs. Pumphrey was silly, she was tender hearted. She cried bitterly when Tricky was taken to the hospital. She packed all of Tricky's belongings to be taken to the hospital. She even sent eggs, wine, and brandy to the hospital, thinking that all of those would help Tricky recover from the surgery. She was happy and grateful to Dr. Harriet for making Tricky healthy. She went to the extent of calling it a triumph of surgery. So, we can say that Mrs. Pumphrey was a rich, foolishly indulgent, ignorant, anxious, silly, tender hearted, and a grateful person. Tricky was well aware of the fact that his mistress loves him dearly. But sadly enough, he gives in to the greed developed due to all the food given to him. Thus, he becomes sick. At the hospital, he is well taken care of by Dr. Harriet and his staff. There, Tricky gels with all the other dogs. With proper diet and lot of exercise, he once again becomes fit and fine. At the end, when Mrs. Pumphrey comes to collect him, he leaps from the arms of Dr. Harriet into his mistress's lap. Thus, we see that Tricky is a lovable and a faithful dog. So, the story, A Triumph of Surgery, has much significance in our life as well. Not only adults, but also children tend to put on weight and grow ill due to their parents' overprotective nature. Many children become overweight and spoiled just because the parents try to meet every demand and fail to give them proper exercise for their body and mind. The story focuses on people who have disposable money with no avenues to spend. They probably don't inculcate a pastime or a hobby. Obviously, they easily get bored and hence indulge in silly behaviors. These actions do more harm than good to the objective of affection. Loving and being affectionate towards a child or a pet is not wrong, but not to the extent that they lose out on their basic understanding between the good and the bad. And as far as pets are concerned, they are not objects to be shown around. They are real living creatures. As much as they need love and affection, they need a proper diet and a healthy lifestyle to survive well.